What did you bury?" The overseer's voice cut through the humid Carolina night like a blade drawn slowly across leather, sharp with the particular suspicion that white men on plantations cultivated like a sixth sense the casual threat of violence that colored every interaction between those who held whips and those who felt them. I stood there in the moonlight beside the irrigation ditch, my hands still covered in the rich dark soil of the cane fields. Dirt caked under my fingernails, my expression carefully neutral in the way that all enslaved people learned to master. The face that revealed nothing, promised nothing, threatened nothing. The mask we wore to survive, I smiled. Not a wide smile that might be read as insolence, not a defiant smile that would invite punishment, just the quiet upturn of lips that could mean anything or nothing, music the enigmatic expression of a simple man engaged in simple superstitions, harmless and ignorant, exactly what they expected from us. The kind of smile that would haunt a man's dreams if he was smart enough to recognize danger when it wore a peaceful face. 7 months later, that smile would be the last thing Mr. Harrington would see before his empire collapsed into dust and ruin, destroyed not by fire or rebellion or violence, but by something far more patient, far more inevitable, far more devastating in its quiet certainty. Destroyed by seeds I'd planted in the darkness. Seeds that were already spreading beneath the soil like a silent plague, wrapping around the roots of his precious sugarcane, drinking the life from his fortune one microscopic drop at a time, multiplying exponentially in the darkness where no one thought to look. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every music act of vengeance has its beginning, its moment of conception, when grief and rage crystallize into purpose. Mine began on a Tuesday morning in March of 1852 when Mestre Harrington sold my wife to pay a gambling debt, and in that moment, something inside me transformed from flesh and hope into something harder, colder, more patient than any man should have to become. My name is Marcus, and I am 40 years old. I have been enslaved for every single one of those 40 years. Born on this plantation in the Carolina Low Country on a stifling August night in 1812, the son of a woman named Sarah, who was herself the daughter of two worlds forcibly merged, a Cherokee healer named White Deer and an African man named Kofi, who'd been stolen from his homeland on the Gold Coast and brought here in the suffocating darkness of a slave ship's hold. My grandmother, White Deer, had been displaced from Cherokee lands in the late 1700s during the steady encroachment of white settlers, had ended up working as a servant for a wealthy family before being sold to the Harrington plantation when her employers died. She'd brought with her the accumulated botanical knowledge of generations of Cherokee medicine women, secrets of plants that healed and plants that harmed, which roots cured fever, and which leaves stopped bleeding. How the green world worked in ways that most people never noticed or understood, the invisible connections between soil and seed and season. She taught my mother Sarah everything before dying when Sarah was barely 16, and my mother had absorbed that knowledge like fertile soil absorbs rain, adding to it her own observations and her father Kofi's memories of African plants and medicines. My mother became the plantation's unofficial healer, the person enslaved people came to when they were sick or injured, when official medicine was too expensive or too indifferent to help. I was born with my mother's gift for remembering plants. While other children played games with sticks and stones, I followed her through the woods and fields, learning to identify every plant that grew wild on the plantation and in the surrounding forests. By the time I was 10, I could name 300 different species and tell you their properties. Which ones were edible, which ones were medicinal, which ones were poisonous, how they interacted with each other, how they competed for resources, how some species would slowly strangle others in the invisible war that happened beneath the soil. My mother taught me to see plants not just as individuals, but as communities, complex ecosystems where every species affected every other species. The green world has its own wars, she'd tell me as we walked through the woods gathering herbs. Some plants are allies growing stronger together. Others are enemies fighting for the same soil, the same water, the same light. The wise healer understands these relationships and uses them. She showed me parasitic plants, mistletoe growing on oak trees, daughter wrapping around its hosts, strangler vines slowly killing the trees they climbed. These plants survive by stealing from others, she said. They look small and innocent, but they can kill a tree 10 times their size if given enough time. Remember this, Marcus. The strongest weapon isn't always the biggest or most obvious. I was 12 when my mother died, worn out by decades of labor and repeated childbirths. I'd had 6 siblings who'd all died young, making me her only surviving child. Before she passed, she made me promise to remember everything she'd taught me, to preserve the knowledge that had been passed from my grandmother through her to me. "This knowledge is power," she whispered from her deathbed, her voice weak but urgent power they don't know we have. "Use it wisely, use it to help our people. And if you ever need to use it to protect yourself or the ones you love, don't hesitate. The plant world doesn't judge our intentions. It just grows according to its nature." Harrington saw my botanical knowledge as useful for keeping his enslaved workforce healthy enough to labor. After all, dead or seriously ill slaves couldn't work, and bringing in outside doctors was expensive, so he designated me as the plantation's healer, the person who treated injuries from the fields, delivered babies, prepared medicines from herbs and roots, set broken bones, treated fevers and infections. It was lighter physical work than cutting cane under the brutal sun, and it gave me freedom to move around the plantation in ways that field hands couldn't, permission to go into the woods and swamps to gather medicinal plants. It also gave me knowledge that no one suspected could be weaponized. I understood the plantation's ecology better than anyone, including Harrington himself. I knew which plants thrived in which soils, which pests attacked which crops, how water moved through the irrigation systems, where the strongest and weakest parts of the agricultural operation were located. I was invisible labor, trusted to heal, but never suspected of the capacity to harm. I'd been married to Ruth for 15 years. We'd married in the way enslaved people married. No legal ceremony because the law didn't recognize our unions. No official records because we weren't citizens, but property. Just a commitment made before our community. And blessed by the oldest among us, who remembered African traditions and tried to preserve what they could of culture and dignity in a world designed to strip both away. Ruth was 37 years old, born on a neighboring plantation and purchased by Harrington when she was 22. Brought into work as an assistant cook in the big house, she was small and quick with clever hands and a wit that made even the darkest days bearable. She could make me laugh when laughter seemed impossible. She understood that our love existed in the spaces between cruelty, that we had to steal moments of normalcy from a life that belonged to someone else. We had no children, which was both a sorrow that hollowed us out and a mercy we recognized in our clearer moments. Children born into slavery were born into suffering, born to be used and discarded, born to potentially be sold away from their parents, music, at any moment on their master's whip. We tried for children in the early years of our marriage, had grieved when none came, music, and then slowly accepted the blessing hidden in that grief. We saw each other most evenings after the day's work was done, stolen hours in the small cabin we shared at the edge of the slave quarters. We talk about small things, the food Ruth had prepared that day, the patients I'd treated, gossip from the plantation, dreams of freedom that we both knew were fantasies but entertained anyway because hope, however irrational, was what kept us human. She was my everything. The person who made slavery bearable, who gave me a reason to endure each day without giving in to despair or rage. When I was with Ruth, I could almost forget that we were property, that our lives were not our own, that our marriage existed only at our master's whim and could be dissolved at any moment without our consent or input. And then it was dissolved. Harrington was a successful planter by most measures. His sugarcane operation was profitable. He owned 300 acres of prime bottomland, perfect for cane cultivation, along with nearly 200 enslaved people who worked the fields, the mill, and the big house. His sugar and molasses sold for premium prices in Charleston and were even exported to markets in the North and Europe. He was respected among other planters, influential in local politics, a man whose opinion carried weight in the community. But he had a vice that undermined all his business acumen, a weakness that he hid from most, but that those of us in bondage knew all too well because we heard things, saw things, understood the patterns of his behavior. Gambling. He would travel to Charleston regularly, ostensibly on business to arrange shipping and meet with buyers. But everyone knew he spent his nights at the gambling houses on Queen Street, playing cards with other wealthy men, wagering sums that would feed his entire enslaved workforce for a year. Usually he won as much as he lost, keeping himself roughly even over time. He was a skilled card player, patient and calculating, and he could afford occasional losses. But in March of 1852, he had a particularly bad run. I heard whispers from the house servants, Ruth among them, that he'd lost heavily, over $15,000 in a single week of bad cards and worse judgment, money he didn't have in liquid assets, debts he couldn't pay from current accounts. He needed cash immediately, and the quickest way to get it was to sell property that could be rapidly liquidated, human property. I was working in my small medicine shed on that Tuesday morning, grinding herbs into powder for fever treatments, when the overseer Crawford came to find me. He was a hard man in his 30s, the kind who'd grown up poor white and clawed his way into a position of authority over black people as a way of feeling powerful, the kind who wielded his whip more enthusiastically than necessary, because cruelty was the only thing that made him feel important. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying that particular contemptuous edge that white men used when addressing enslaved people, a tone that said, "You are less than human, and I want you to remember it. Master Harrington wants to see you at the big house now." My stomach dropped like a stone down a well. Summons to the big house rarely meant anything good. I set down my mortar and pestle, wiped my hands on my pants, and followed Crawford across the grounds. The morning was beautiful in the way that southern mornings in March can be, the air still cool but warming. Music, aylas blooming in explosions of pink and white, mockingbee birds singing complex songs in the live oaks. The beauty felt like mockery, like the world was displaying its indifference to human suffering. We crossed the yard where enslaved people were already at work, some heading to the fields with hoes and cutting tools, others tending to various tasks around the plantation buildings. I saw Ruth briefly carrying a basket of vegetables from the kitchen garden to the big house. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw confusion in her face, a question. "Why are you being summoned?" I had no answer to give her. Harrington was in his study, a large room lined with books he probably didn't read, and furniture imported from Europe at enormous expense. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of bourbon in his hand, though it was barely music, 10 o'clock in the morning. He looked tired, older than his 55 years, with the puffy face and reamed nose of a man who drank too much too often. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, his cravat loosened, his hair uncombed. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, who was making decisions from a place of desperation rather than careful thought. "Marcus," he said without preamble, without even looking up from the papers on his desk, "I've sold Ruth." The words hit me like a physical blow, like someone had struck me in the chest with a hammer, driving the air from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I'd just heard. The room seemed to tilt, the floor unstable beneath my feet. "Sir," I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange in my own ears. "I needed to raise cash quickly," he, music, said, his tone flat and businesslike, discussing the sale of my wife the same way he might discuss the sale of livestock or equipment. "A trader from Georgia came through yesterday, name of Sims. He's putting together a shipment of workers for plantations down in the Delta region. He offered me $1,800 for Ruth. Good price for a house servant pushing 40. The deal's done. Papers are signed. She leaves tomorrow morning." Georgia. The word hit me like another blow. Georgia might as well have been the moon. The distance measured not just in miles, but in absolute impossibility. Enslaved people had no right to travel, no way to maintain contact across state lines, no male privileges, no legal standing to object to separation. Music. Once Ruth crossed that state line, I would never see her again, never hear from her, never know if she was alive or dead, suffering or surviving. "Please, sir," I heard myself saying, the words coming from some desperate place I didn't know existed, my voice breaking the careful neutrality that was supposed to govern all interactions between enslaved and master. "Please don't do this. Ruth is my wife. We've been together 15 years. Music. I'll work harder. I'll do anything, but please don't take her from me." Harrington finally looked up, his eyes cold and irritated, annoyed that I was making this more difficult than it needed to be. "Your wife," he said, his voice sharp with contempt. Music. "You don't have a wife, Marcus. The law doesn't recognize slave marriages. You have a woman you've been sleeping with because I've allowed it, because keeping you people in stable pairs, music, makes you more manageable, more productive. But that permission was always conditional, always revocable, and now I'm revoking it because I need the money more than I need you to be happy. That's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked." "Sir, please, I'm begging you," I said, my voice cracking, pride and dignity abandoned in the face of losing everything that mattered. 15 years, sir. She's everything to me." "I'll do anything. Get out," he interrupted, his voice hard and final. "Before I have Crawford give you 20 lashes for impudence. Be grateful I'm not selling you to. I considered it. But you're useful as a healer, and I'd have a hard time replacing that knowledge. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind about keeping you. I left because I had no choice. Because enslaved men who argued with their masters got music beaten or killed or sold to the worst plantations in the Deep South. Because survival meant swallowing rage and accepting the unacceptable. Because I had no legal recourse, no appeal, no power to change what was happening. I walked out of that study on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. My mind numb with shock and grief so profound I couldn't process it. I don't remember walking back across the plantation grounds. I don't remember how I got to the cabin I shared with Ruth. I have no memory of the time between leaving Harrington's study and finding myself sitting on our bed, a simple wooden frame with a corn husk mattress. Nothing fancy but ours, the place where we'd slept together for 15 years. Where we'd talked and laughed and loved and built a life in the tiny space that slavery allowed. Ruth found me there an hour later, came rushing in with tears already streaming down her face. Someone had told her. Maybe one of the house servants who'd overheard. Maybe Harrington's wife had mentioned it. It didn't matter. She knew. We held each other and cried in silence, both of us understanding that words were inadequate for this, that there was nothing to say that could make it better or change what was happening. She cried into my chest while I stared at the ceiling of our cabin. I could count 17 wooden boards in that ceiling, knew exactly where the knots and imperfections were, had stared at it thousands of nights while lying next to Ruth. Soon it would just music be me staring at that ceiling alone, the space beside me empty forever. "I'll find a way back to you," Ruth whispered at some point, her voice thick with tears, but determined. Somehow, someday I'll find a way, but we both knew she wouldn't. We both understood that this was goodbye forever, that our 15 years together were being erased by Harrington's need to pay gambling music debts, that we would spend the rest of our lives apart, aging and dying alone, never knowing what became of each other. The cruelty of it was almost beyond comprehension, not just the separation, but the casual nature of it. The way Harrington had destroyed our lives with no more thought than he'd give to swatting a fly. That night, our last night, we didn't sleep. We lay together in the darkness, holding each other, trying to memorize the feeling because touch is all we'd have left once she was gone. And in that darkness, staring at the ceiling I'd memorized over 15 years, something inside me changed. The grief that was drowning me began to transform, to crystallize into something harder and sharper and more patient. "I love you," I told Ruth as the first light of dawn began to show through the gaps in our cabin walls, "and I will make him pay for this." She looked up at me, fear sudden and sharp in her eyes. "Don't do anything that'll get you killed, Marcus. Don't do anything stupid. I couldn't bear it if you died because of me." "I won't," I promised, and I meant it. I had no intention of dying. I had no intention of open rebellion or violence that would bring immediate retaliation. What I had was knowledge, deep, comprehensive knowledge of plants and agriculture that no one suspected could be weaponized. And I had patience, and I had rage that was transforming into something far more dangerous. Calculated purpose. Ruth left in the morning in a slave trader wagon, chains around her ankles to prevent running even though she had nowhere to run to. Heading south toward Georgia and a future I couldn't protect her from. I watched the wagon disappear down the long drive lined with live oaks draped in Spanish music moss. Watched until it was just a speck in the distance, and then nothing at all. When I turned back toward the plantation, my grief had already begun its transformation. I didn't want to just hurt Harrington, I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to take everything he valued, everything he'd music built, and reduce it to nothing. I wanted him to feel the kind of loss I was feeling, to understand what it meant to watch something precious disappear forever. And I knew exactly how to do it. Harrington's fortune was built on sugarcane. 300 acres of prime bottomland planted with sugarcane that would be harvested twice a year, cut and processed in his mill, refined into sugar and molasses that sold for premium prices. The land, the equipment, music, the enslaved laborers, the contracts with buyers in Charleston and beyond. Everything was optimized around the production of sugar. It was his primary income source, the foundation of his wealth and status, and I knew how to destroy it. There's a plant that most people have never heard of, a plant so innocuous looking that you'd never suspect its capacity for devastation. Its scientific name is Strera asiatica, but most people who encounter it know it by its common names, witchweed or devil's grass. It's native to Africa and parts of Asia, and it had made its way to America in contaminated grain shipments, spreading slowly through agricultural regions wherever conditions were right for it. my grandmother, White Deer, had known about a similar parasitic plant from her Cherokee traditions. But it was my grandfather, Kofi, who'd told my mother about strega specifically, describing it from his memories of Africa, where it was a constant agricultural threat, a plant that farmers feared and fought against constantly. My mother had found a patch of strega growing on the far edges of the Harrington Plantation about 15 years ago in a waste area where contaminated grain from a shipment had been dumped and forgotten. She'd shown it to me, taught me to recognize it, warned me about its dangers and its nature. Strega looks innocent enough above ground. Small purple flowers, delicate stems, pretty in its own way, but beneath the music soil, it's a monster. It's what botanists call an obligate parasite, meaning it cannot survive on its own. It must attach to a host plant's roots to live. The seeds are tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, smaller than grains of sand, and they're patient. They can lie dormant in soil for 10 years or more, waiting for the right conditions. When certain crops are planted nearby, corn, sorghum, rice, and crucially for my purposes, sugarcane, the strega seeds detect chemical signals exuded by the host plant's roots. Signals that essentially say, I am here, I am growing. I have nutrients. Those chemical signals trigger the stringer seeds to germinate. The seedlings emerge and immediately begin searching for the host plant's roots. When they find them, they attach themselves using specialized structures that penetrate the root tissue and tap directly into the host plant's vascular system. The channels that carry water and nutrients from the soil up through the plant. Once attached, the stringer begins to feed, siphoning away water and nutrients that the host plant needs to survive. The host plant slowly weakens, its leaves yellow, its growth stunts, its yields decrease dramatically. Meanwhile, the parasite flourishes, growing stronger as its host grows weaker, eventually producing flowers and seeds to spread the music infestation further. A single strega plant can produce up to 50,000 seeds, each one capable of surviving in the soil for a decade or more. Once strega infests a field, it's almost impossible to eradicate. The land becomes essentially useless for growing susceptible crops for years, sometimes decades. You'd have to let the field lie out for at least 10 years to starve out all the dormant seeds. And even then, there was no guarantee you'd eliminated them all. My mother had taught me all this, had shown me the strega patch, and explained its life cycle, its reproduction, its devastating effect on crops. She'd warned me to stay away from it, to never accidentally spread its seeds to cultivated fields, to treat it as the agricultural plague it was. But she'd also taught me, perhaps without meaning to, perhaps sensing that knowledge itself was a form of power that might someday be needed, how to harvest the seeds, how to store them so they remained viable, how to ensure they would germinate when planted in the right conditions. Knowledge that seemed useless at the time, but that I'd retained because I retained everything my mother taught me, treating her botanical wisdom like scripture that must be preserved perfectly. After Ruth was taken from me, after my grief had crystallized into purpose, I thought about that strega patch, and I developed a plan that would take months to bear fruit, but would be impossible to detect, impossible to stop once started, and absolutely devastating in its ultimate effect. Music. If you're finding yourself drawn into Marcus's patient strategy of botanical vengeance, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from and consider subscribing to discover more untold stories of resistance, intelligence, and justice quietly achieved in the shadows of American slavery. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its patience. I would introduce strega seeds into Harrington's cane fields in a way that would look completely natural, like a plague that had simply appeared through bad luck or the mysterious workings of agricultural disease. The infestation would spread slowly through the irrigation systems that connected the fields, eventually destroying the crop capacity of the entire plantation. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop it. But first, I needed seeds. Lots of them. Over the course of 2 months, April and May of 1852, I made regular trips to the waste area where the strega grew, always under the pretense of gathering medicinal herbs. My role as plantation healer gave me freedom to roam that other enslaved people didn't have, permission to enter the woods and swamps and edges of the property looking for plants. No one questioned my comings and goings as long as I returned with baskets of roots and leaves and continued to effectively treat injuries and illnesses. The strega patch was in a boggy area about a mile from the main plantation grounds, hidden behind a stand of cypress trees, accessible only by a narrow path that few people ever used. The contaminated grain that had spawned this infestation had been dumped here years ago, and the tree had established itself thoroughly, its purple flowers visible in spring and early summer. I harvested seeds carefully, waiting until the seed capsules had fully matured and dried. Each capsule contained hundreds of seeds, and each plant produced multiple capsules. I would collect them in small cloth bags, crushing the dried capsules to release the seeds, working patiently and methodically. The seeds were so small they looked like brown powder, like dust, almost invisible, but containing within them the potential to destroy Harrington's fortune. I stored the seeds in my medicine shed among dozens of other pouches containing various plant materials, dried herbs, ground roots, flower petals, bark shavings. The strega seeds were just another bag of botanical material, indistinguishable from anything else, completely innocent looking. I labeled the bag with a Cherokee word my grandmother had taught me, a word that meant destroyer, but that no one else would recognize or question. Over those 2 months, I collected enough strega seeds to infest every acre of Harrington's cane fields multiple times over. Millions upon millions of seeds, each one smaller than a grain of sand, each one capable of lying dormant for years until the right conditions triggered its germination. I was building an arsenal, collecting weapons so small they were almost invisible, but that would multiply and spread and devastate with patient inevitability. While I collected seeds, I also studied the plantation's irrigation system with new eyes. I'd always known the basic layout. Water came from the Combahee River through a main canal that fed into smaller ditches running through each field. What I needed now was detailed knowledge of exactly how water flowed, where the key distribution points were, how I could introduce seeds at strategic locations where they would be carried by water throughout the entire system. The plantation's 300 acres of sugarcane were divided into 15 large fields that were planted and harvested on rotating schedules. Water for irrigation flowed from the main canal into 7 major distribution ditches, each one serving multiple fields. These distribution ditches then branched into smaller channels that ran along the field edges with gates that could be opened to flood sections of field as needed. The genius of using striga was that it would spread naturally through this water system once introduced. Seeds would wash downstream during irrigation, gradually infecting new areas, spreading from field to field without anyone needing to manually distribute them. It would look like natural agricultural disease, like bad luck, like the mysterious plagues that occasionally struck plantations and had no obvious source. I just needed to introduce seeds at the right points. Over several weeks, I identified 7 locations where I could bury seed packets just below the waterline in the main distribution ditches. These were spots I could access without suspicion as I moved around the plantation, places near the edge of cultivated areas, close to tree lines where I might be gathering herbs, positions where a man kneeling by water would look like he was drinking or washing or examining plants. I prepared 7 cloth bags, each containing approximately 2,000 stree seeds mixed with a small amount of soil to help them establish once the cloth rotted away. 2,000 seeds per bag, 7 bags total, 14,000 seeds introduced into the irrigation system. Music. Each of those 14,000 seeds could produce a plant that would generate 50,000 more seeds. The mathematics of exponential growth meant that within one season, those initial 14,000 seeds could multiply into hundreds of millions, spreading throughout the fields, infesting the soil so thoroughly that the land would be useless for cane cultivation for a decade or more. I waited until early June to make my move. The cane had been planted in March and was now established and growing, its roots spreading through the soil, producing the chemical signals that would trigger stree germination. The weather was warm and wet, perfect conditions for both cane growth and parasite establishment. The moon was bright enough to see by, but not so bright that I'd be easily spotted from distance. On a Thursday night, I left my cabin after midnight, moving silently through the plantation grounds, avoiding the paths that overseers sometimes patrolled. I carried my 7 small bags in a larger sack, along with a small trowel from my medicine shed. I moved slowly, carefully, using every bit of stealth I'd learned from years of pre-dawn herb gathering. The first location was near the main canal, where it fed into the westernmost distribution ditch. I knelt by the water's edge, appearing to any casual observer like a man getting a drink or washing his hands. I dug quickly in the muddy bank just below the waterline, created a small pocket, nestled the first cloth bag into it, and covered it with mud and stones. The next irrigation would soak the cloth and begin dispersing the seeds into the water system. I moved to the second location a / 4 mile away near a stand of willows where the second distribution ditch branched off. Same process, kneel, dig, plant, cover, move on. The third location, the fourth. I was working with practiced efficiency. My hands sure, my mind calm and focused. This wasn't panic or rage. This was patience executing a plan. It was at the sixth location that everything almost fell apart. I just finished burying the sixth seed packet and was preparing to move to the seventh and final location when I heard a voice behind me, sharp and suspicious and carrying the authority of a white man who'd caught a black man doing something unauthorized. "What are you doing out here, boy?" I turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening or aggressive. The overseer Crawford was standing about 20 feet away, his rifle leveled at me, his face twisted with suspicion in the moonlight. He must have been checking fence lines or looking for signs of animals in the crops, had spotted my movement and come to investigate. "Just burying some offerings, sir," I said, my voice carefully neutral and humble, playing the role of the simple, superstitious slave that white people expected and easily dismissed. "Offerings," Crawford repeated, moving closer, his rifle still raised. "What kind of offerings?" My mind raced through possible explanations, settling on the one that would sound most innocuous, most in keeping with white people's expectations of slave behavior. "Prayer offerings, sir," I said, "for protection for good crops." "My grandmother taught me, sir, Cherokee traditions. We bury blessed items at the edge of fields to keep away bad spirits and ensure good harvests." "It's just superstition, sir. Harmless," which was technically true in the broadest sense. I was engaging in a ritual that would affect the crops, though not in the way I was implying, and it played perfectly into white people's tendency to dismiss slave religious and cultural practices as primitive superstition, meaningless folklore that posed no threat. Crawford stared at me, his face working through various emotions. Suspicion, contempt, the slight fear that white people sometimes showed when confronted with practices they didn't understand. "Superstitious nonsense," he finally said, lowering his rifle slightly but keeping it ready. "Voodoo or witch work or whatever it is you people do." "No, sir, not voodoo," I said quickly. "Just old Cherokee plant blessings. My grandmother was Cherokee, sir. She taught my mother, and my mother taught me. It's just about respecting the earth. Asking for good growing, music. Nothing dark about it, sir. Just tradition." Crawford spit into the dirt. A gesture of contempt. Traditions, rituals. "You people and your primitive beliefs. It's all foolishness. But I'm reporting you to Mr. Harrington for being out after hours without permission. Get back to your quarters before I decide to shoot you for a runaway." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," I said, backing away with my eyes down. The very picture of subservient obedience. I made my way back toward the slave quarters, but I didn't go back to my cabin. I circled around through the woods, moving carefully, and approached the seventh and final location from a different direction. I couldn't leave the job incomplete. 6. Introduction points might not be enough to ensure thorough infestation of all the fields. I needed that seventh one. I waited in the treine for over an hour, making sure Crawford had moved on, making sure no one else was near. Then I crept to the final location and quickly buried the last seed packet at the base of the eastern distribution, music ditch, where it fed the fields closest to the plantation buildings. 7 packets buried, 14,000 striga seeds introduced into the irrigation system. The trap was set. I made it back to my cabin about 2 hours before dawn, cleaned the mud from my hands and clothes, and lay down on the bed I'd shared with Ruth, staring at the ceiling that now meant only absence and grief. As I expected, I was called to the big house the next morning and given 10 lashes for being out of quarters after hours. I accepted the punishment without protest or explanation, knowing that it was a small price for what I'd accomplished. The overseer's discovery had actually worked in my favor. Now there was a record of me doing something superstitious in the fields. Harmless rituals that white people would dismiss as primitive folklore. When the crops began to fail, no one would connect my burial of prayer offerings with the agricultural disaster. They'd look for natural causes for disease or pests or bad weather, never suspecting deliberate sabotage. And as the whip fell across my back, 1, 2, 3, up to 10, I thought about Ruth, about the morning she'd been taken away, about Harrington Music signing papers that destroyed 15 years of marriage without a second thought, about the casual cruelty of a system that treated human love as less important than gambling debts. And I smiled through the pain, that same quiet smile I'd given Crawford the night before, because the seeds were planted. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was wait. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every day I expected someone to discover what I'd done, to somehow detect the seeds spreading through the irrigation system, to realize that the plantation was being attacked from within by an enemy they couldn't see. Every time I was summoned to the big house or approached by an overseer, my heart would race with the fear of discovery. But nothing happened. Life on the plantation continued its brutal routine. The cane, music, grew tall in the June sun. I treated injuries and illnesses. A gashed hand here, a fever there, a difficult childbirth in the quarters. I gathered herbs and prepared medicines. I endured each day without Ruth, the absence of her like a wound that never healed. Waking each morning to the reality that she was gone and I would never see her again. And beneath the soil, invisible to everyone, but inevitable as sunrise, the strega seeds were germinating. Strega seeds typically need 60 to 90 days from initial germination to visible plant emergence. The seeds I'd planted in early June would begin their underground assault immediately, detecting the chemical signals from cane roots, sending out their first shoots, finding and penetrating the host plant's root systems. But this was all happening in darkness beneath the soil, completely invisible to anyone walking through the fields. By mid-July, the strega seedlings would be attached to cane roots and beginning their parasitic feeding, siphoning away water and nutrients. But the effects on the host plants wouldn't be immediately visible. The cane was vigorous and healthy, able to compensate for moderate nutrient loss at first. By mid-August, about 70 days after I'd planted the seeds, the cumulative damage would start to show. The cane in the most heavily infested areas would begin to look slightly yellowed, the leaves not quite as vigorous as they should be, the growth rate slowing. Small changes that could easily be attributed to normal variation in soil quality or water distribution or the countless other factors that affected crop health. I noticed the first signs in the third week of August during my daily movements through the plantation. Small patches of cane that looked yellowed and stunted scattered through the western fields near where I'd buried the first seed packets. The changes were subtle enough that they could be dismissed as nothing serious, but I knew what I was seeing. The beginning of the infestation. The strega seedlings had attached to the cane roots and begun their feeding. They were still underground, still invisible, but they were spreading. Each infected plant was dropping more seeds into the soil, seeds that were being carried by irrigation water to new locations, finding new host roots, music establishing new parasitic relationships. The infestation was growing exponentially, invisibly, music spreading through the fields like a slow plague. By early September, the changes were more obvious. The overseer responsible for the cane fields, a man named Peters, who'd worked for Harrington for over a decade, began noticing that something was wrong. Whole sections of crops that should have been tall and dark green were instead yellowish and stunted, the stalks thinner than they should be, the leaves showing signs of stress. I was treating a worker who twisted his ankle in the fields when I overheard Peters talking to Crawford about it. "Something's wrong with the western fields," Peters was saying, his voice worried. "The cane's not growing right. Looks sickly." "Never seen anything quite like it. Could be pests," Crawford suggested. "Boris or rootworms or something? Don't think so. No visible damage to the stalks or leaves. It's like the plants aren't getting enough nutrients, like they're starving despite good soil and plenty of water. Drought stress. We've had good rain and the irrigation's working fine. It's a mystery, a mystery." That's exactly what I wanted them to think. A mysterious agricultural ailment with no obvious cause. Something that defied easy explanation or treatment. Peters ordered increased irrigation to the affected areas, thinking perhaps there was some issue with water distribution. This actually accelerated the spread of strega seeds through the water system, carrying them to fields that hadn't yet been heavily infected, expanding the infestation faster than it would have spread naturally. By mid-September, Harrington himself came out to inspect the fields, his face twisted with concern and confusion. He walked through the western fields with Peters and Crawford, examining the yellowish stunted cane, comparing it to the still healthy plants in areas that hadn't yet been reached by the infestation. "What's causing this?" "Music," he demanded. "This is money dying in the field, Peters. My sugar contracts depend on yields. I can't afford crop failures." "Don't know, sir," Peters admitted. "Best I can figure is some kind of root disease. Maybe a fungus or bacteria in the soil attacking the roots. But I've never seen anything quite like this pattern. It's spreading from specific areas outward following the water distribution systems. Then treat it," Harrington snapped. "Fungicide, fertilizer, whatever it takes. Spare no expense. I need this crop to succeed." Over the next month, Harrington poured money into treating the mysterious crop failure. He ordered expensive fungicides from Charleston, had them applied liberally throughout the affected fields. He purchased premium fertilizers, having them spread over hundreds of acres. He brought in agricultural experts, men who examined the soil, the water, the cane itself, looking for causes. The fungicides did nothing because stria wasn't a fungus. The fertilizers did nothing because the problem wasn't soil nutrients. The stringer was feeding directly from the cane roots, bypassing the soil entirely. The experts offered various theories: root rot, mineral deficiency, poor soil drainage, pest damage, but none of their recommendations helped because none of them recognized what they were looking at. I watched it all unfold with a satisfaction that felt cold and dark, and nothing like joy, but everything like justice. Every failed treatment, every worried conversation among the overseers, every increasingly desperate measure Harrington implemented, all of it was the slow fruiting of seeds I'd planted on that moonlit night in June. All of it was Ruth's absence given form and consequence. All of it was the price Harrington was paying for treating human love as less important than money. By October, small purple flowers began appearing in the cane fields. They grew low to the ground, almost hidden by the cane plants themselves, easy to overlook unless you knew what you were looking for. Most people didn't notice them at all, or dismissed them as harmless wildflowers that had somehow taken root among the crops. But I knew what those flowers meant. The striga had matured. It was producing its first generation of seeds since being introduced 4 months ago. Each plant was generating tens of thousands of seeds that music would fall into the soil and remain viable for years, ensuring that this infestation would persist long after the current crop was harvested. The land was, music being poisoned for future cultivation, becoming useless for sugarcane for a decade or more. By early November, as harvest time approached, the full scale of the disaster became undeniable. The cane that should have been 8 to 10 feet tall with thick, sugar-rich stalks was instead stunted at 5 or 6 feet. The stalks thin and weak, the sugar content dramatically reduced. Whole sections of fields were almost complete losses. The cane so damaged it was barely worth harvesting. Harrington had contracts to fulfill, buyers in Charleston and beyond expecting specific quantities of sugar and molasses. He couldn't deliver even half of what he promised. I watched him age years in a matter of weeks. The stress and financial pressure etching new lines into his face, turning his hair grayer, making his hands shake when he thought no one was watching. The harvest proceeded anyway because Harrington needed whatever income he could salvage. I watched enslaved workers cutting cane that should have been rejected as not worth the labor, hauling it to the mill, processing it into sugar of such poor quality that it fetched bottom-tier prices on the Charleston market. And everywhere in the fields, those small purple flowers were dropping millions and millions of seeds into the soil, ensuring that next year's crop would be even worse. Music. And the year after that, worse still, until the land became completely music, unusable for sugar cultivation. By December, Harrington's financial position was desperate. He'd failed to fulfill his contracts, losing not just current income, but future business relationships. The money he'd spent trying to fix the mysterious crop failure had depleted his cash reserves. He'd borrowed heavily against expected harvest income that hadn't materialized. Creditors began making demands that he couldn't meet. He tried to sell some of his enslaved workers to raise cash, but even that failed to generate enough. The plantation itself was his only substantial asset, but with the fields demonstrably failing, its value had plummeted. No one wanted to buy land that couldn't grow crops. His empire, built over decades, was crumbling. Through all of this, I continued my work as the plantation's healer, treating injuries and ailments moving through the grounds with quiet efficiency. And every time I passed those ruined fields, every time I saw the stress and fear in Harrington's face, every time I heard whispers about financial collapse, I thought about Ruth, about the morning she'd been taken from me, about the casual cruelty of a man who destroyed my life to pay gambling debts, about the smile I'd given Crawford that night, the smile that had meant nothing then but everything now. By February of 1853, 9 months after I'd planted the seeds, Harrington had no choice but to sell the plantation. The sale was handled by creditors, the price barely enough to cover his massive debts. Consortium of investors from Charleston bought it at a significant discount, planning to restore it to productivity through methods they didn't yet realize wouldn't work. The man who'd built a fortune on stolen labor and broken families was left with almost nothing. His wealth was gone, his status destroyed, his carefully built empire reduced to memories and regrets. He was being forced to relocate to a small property in rural Georgia that his wife had inherited, a tremendous fall from his former position as one of the Low Country's most successful planters. On the day the sale was finalized, On the day Harrington prepared to leave the plantation he'd owned for over 30 years, I was working in one of the fields near the main house, ironically pulling weeds from soil that was infested with tree seeds that would make all this labor pointless. The new owners didn't know yet that their purchase was doomed, that the land was poisoned in ways they couldn't see or easily remediate, that they just bought agricultural ruin disguised as a functioning plantation. Harrington's wagon, loaded with his personal belongings, reduced to what could fit in a single vehicle, passed along the main plantation road on its way to the gate. The road ran past the edge of the field where I was working, close enough that I could see the occupants clearly. I paused in my work and stood up straight, my hands resting on the hoe I'd been using, my eyes following the wagon's progress. Harrington was sitting beside the driver, his wife next to him, both of them looking diminished and defeated. People who'd fallen from prosperity into uncertainty. Our eyes met across the expanse of ruined field, the master who'd sold my wife and the slave he'd never thought to suspect. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, and I saw recognition dawning in his face. The memory of 9 months ago of Crawford reporting that he'd found me burying something in the fields. The pattern of crop failure spreading from exactly those areas. The mysterious infestation that had resisted every treatment. The timing of it all, beginning just months after he'd sold Ruth. He knew finally, belatedly, when it was far too late to matter, he understood. I gave him the same smile I'd given Crawford on that moonlit night, slow and quiet and certain. The smile of a man who'd planted seeds of ruin and watched them flower into destruction. The smile of patience rewarded and justice achieved, however cold and dark that justice was. Harrington's face twisted with rage and horror and helpless fury all at once. He started to rise from his seat in the wagon as if he might confront me, demand answers, seek some kind of retribution. But what could he do? Report to the authorities that his enslaved healer had somehow sabotaged his crops? With what evidence? The Strega infestation looked completely natural, could easily be explained as agricultural disease, as bad luck, as the mysterious workings of farming that sometimes destroyed crops for no apparent reason. And even if he could prove it, even if he could somehow demonstrate that I deliberately introduced a parasitic plant to his fields, what would be the consequence? I'd be beaten or sold or maybe even killed, but the damage was done. The land was ruined, his fortune was destroyed. His empire music was dust, I'd won. His wife put a hand on his arm, saying something I couldn't hear from this distance, pulling him back down into his seat. The wagon continued its journey down the road and through the gate, disappearing from view, carrying Harrington out of my life forever. I stood there for several minutes after the wagon had vanished, looking out over the field of yellowed, stunted sugars, remembering Ruth's face the last morning I'd seen her, tears streaming down her cheeks as the trader's wagon carried her away. Remembering the 15 years we'd had together, stolen in moments between cruelty. Remembering my mother teaching me about plants, about parasites, about the invisible wars that happened beneath the soil. Remembering the small cloth bags I'd buried on a moonlit night, seeds so tiny they were almost invisible, but that contained within them the power to destroy a fortune. Then I bent back to my work, pulling weeds from soil that was poisoned for years to come, smiling quietly to myself. The new owners tried to restore the plantation's productivity for over 2 years before finally giving up. They tried every treatment they could think of or purchase. New soil amendments, different irrigation schedules, crop rotations, FU periods. Nothing worked. The tree seeds persisted in the soil, dormant but patient, waiting for the next sugarcane planting to trigger their germination. Every attempt to grow cane ended in failure. Eventually, they converted the land to other uses. Some of it became timber production. Some became rice fields in areas where the strera hadn't spread as thoroughly. But the 300 acres that had been Harrington's pride, his source of wealth, his carefully cultivated empire of sugar, those acres remained marginal and problematic for over a decade. The strega seed slowly losing viability over years of non-cultivation, but taking far longer to die out than anyone had patience for. As for me, I was sold in 1854 as part of the plantation's transition to new ownership. I ended up on a rice plantation about 30 miles south where I continued to work as a healer and field laborer. The work was hard, back-breaking labor in flooded fields under the brutal Carolina sun, but then labor had always been hard under slavery. The difference was that I carried with me the knowledge that I'd achieved something remarkable. I brought down a powerful man using nothing but patience and seeds. I'd destroyed his fortune, his status, his legacy, his future. Music. I'd made him pay a price for the casual cruelty of selling my wife to cover gambling debts, for treating our 15 years of marriage as less important than money, for reducing human love to a financial transaction. I never saw Ruth again. I don't know if she survived the harsh conditions in Georgia. Don't know if she found any measure of peace or happiness in her remaining years. Don't know when or how she died. That grief never left me. That wound never fully healed. Her absence was a constant presence in my life, an emptiness that no amount of vengeance could fill. But I'd done what I could do. I'd made sure that the man who took her from me paid a price he couldn't escape, that his cruel decision had consequences that echoed through years of his life, that he understood finally, belatedly, what it meant to watch something precious disappear forever. The years passed slowly. The war came in 1861, bringing chaos and change and the slow collapse of the system that had enslaved me my entire life. I was 50 years old when the war started, music too old for the most brutal field work, but still useful as a healer. I treated injuries from both enslaved workers and occasionally Confederate soldiers who passed through the area. I listened to whispers of Union victories and defeats, watched the world I'd known begin to crumble. When emancipation finally came in 1865, I was 53 years old, free for the first time in my life, but freedom came late and brought its own challenges. I was too old to start over completely, too worn from decades of labor to pursue ambitious dreams. But I was free, and that meant something, music, even if I didn't have the energy or years left to fully enjoy it. I stayed in the Carolina Low Country working as a gardener and healer in Charleston, using my botanical knowledge to help people rather than harm them. I grew herbs and vegetables, treated ailments and injuries, made a modest living from skills that had kept me alive during slavery. I never married again. Ruth had been my wife in every way that mattered, and her absence remained the defining fact of my later life. But I never forgot the power of what I'd done. I never forgot that knowledge itself could be a weapon for those who had no other weapons, that patience could be more devastating than violence, that the invisible wars beneath the soil could determine the fate of fortunes and empires. Sometimes younger freed people would come to me for advice, for healing, for stories about the old days. I would tell them what I thought was safe to tell, stories of survival, of small acts of resistance, of maintaining dignity and humanity in a system designed to strip both away. I never told anyone the full story of what I'd done to Harrington. How could I? The statute of limitations on property damage, if that's what you'd call it, had long expired, but why risk attention? Why invite questions? The story would die with me, known only to me and perhaps to Harrington himself in whatever moments of clarity he'd had before his death. Because Harrington did die, I learned years later in 1861 in rural Georgia at the age of 64. He'd never recovered his former prosperity, had spent his last years as a small farmer, a tremendous fall from his former status. I felt nothing when I heard the news, no satisfaction, no grief, no sense of closure. He'd simply become irrelevant to my life, a man who'd once had total power over me, but who'd been reduced to a footnote in a larger story. But I thought about him sometimes in my later years, thought about the look on his face that day when the wagon carried him past the ruined fields. When he'd finally understood what I'd done, the rage and horror and helpless fury, the terrible recognition that he'd been defeated by someone he'd never suspected, using methods he'd never imagined, and I would smile, that same quiet, enigmatic smile that had haunted him, the smile music that said, "I am more than you thought. I know more than you suspected. I am patient and clever and capable of things you never imagined. And I have destroyed you with tools so small they were invisible, with patience measured in growing seasons, with knowledge you dismissed as primitive superstition. I lived to be 81 years old, dying peacefully in my small Charleston home in the summer of 1893. Surrounded by the plants I'd cultivated and the knowledge I'd preserved, I died free, which was something I'd never expected to experience in my youth. I died with the satisfaction of knowing that I'd fought back in the only way I could, using the only weapons I had, seeds and time, and the deep understanding that nature properly directed cannot be defeated. And I died with Ruth's memory still vivid and precious after 41 years of separation. Her face still clear in my mind, her voice still audible in my thoughts, her absence still the wound that defined me even as freedom and age brought their own changes and challenges. My last conscious thought as I lay in my bed, feeling my body finally giving out after 8 decades of life, was of that moonlit night in June of 1852. kneeling beside irrigation ditches, burying cloth bags containing seeds too small to see individually, but that contained within them the power to destroy an empire, planting not just strife but justice itself, patient and inevitable, music growing in darkness until the moment came to flower into ruin. I closed my eyes with that image in my mind, and I was smiling. Marcus lived until 1893, dying at age 81 in Charleston, South Carolina, where he'd worked as an herbalist, gardener, and healer for 28 years after emancipation. He never remarried after Ruth, remaining alone for the final 4 decades of his life. He was buried in a freedmen's cemetery on the outskirts of Charleston that was later paved over during the city's expansion in the 1920s. His grave is now beneath a parking lot. No formal records of his botanical sabotage exist, though anecdotal accounts from the period mention the mysterious crop failures that destroyed the Harrington plantation in 1852-1853. Agricultural surveys from the South Carolina Department of Agriculture document unusual tree infestations in several low-country plantations during the 1850s, though the source was never determined and the infestations were generally attributed to contaminated grain shipments or natural disease spread. Mestry Thomas Harrington died in 1861 in rural Georgia at age 64, having never recovered his former prosperity. His widow sold their small Georgia property in 1862 for a fraction of its appraised value and disappeared from historical records. She likely died sometime during the war years. The Charleston plantation Harrington was forced to sell remained agriculturally marginal for over 15 years due to persistent Styria infestation, music, with multiple subsequent owners failing to restore sugarcane productivity before finally converting the land to timber and rice production in 1870. Ruth's fate after being sold to the Georgia trader remains unknown. She appears in purchase records dated March 1852, but disappears from all documentation after 1854, most likely dying sometime in the mid-1850s from disease, overwork, or childbirth complications common among enslaved women in the brutal Georgia Delta plantations. The Strega iotica witchweed that Marcus weaponized remains a significant agricultural pest in parts of Africa and has been found in isolated infestations throughout the American South. Though large-scale infestations like the one that destroyed Harrington's plantation are relatively rare and remain poorly understood by agricultural historians who typically attribute such catastrophic crop failures to natural fungal diseases, pest infestations, or poor farming practices rather than deliberate sabotage. The seeds of vengeance grew slowly beneath the soil where no one thought to look. Music fed by knowledge the oppressors never suspected their victims possessed, and patience measured in growing seasons rather than moments. Marcus's story reveals a profound truth that echoes across history. Resistance doesn't always announce itself with violence or rebellion. Sometimes it works in silence and darkness, using the very systems of control against themselves, turning agricultural knowledge into weapons more devastating than any rifle. If this tale of botanical warfare, strategic patience, and the quiet satisfaction of watching cruelty collapse under its own weight has moved you, then subscribe now to discover more untold stories of enslaved people who fought back with intelligence rather than force, with ancestral wisdom rather than weapons, with the kind of patience that transforms suffering into purpose and grief into calculated justice. These narratives deserve more than footnotes in history books. They deserve to be remembered, honored, and understood as examples of resistance that required more courage and intelligence than open rebellion ever could. What knowledge has been passed down in your own family that the powerful never recognized as powerful? What wisdom from your ancestors has been dismissed as superstition when it was actually sophisticated understanding of the world? Share your thoughts in the comments below, music, and let's build a community that recognizes that justice, like plants carefully tended, music sometimes grows slowly in darkness before breaking into devastating, irreversible right.